Okay, on behalf of the Sarsway-Hawk Southeast Asia Center and on behalf of the Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Economy Seminar Series, I and my colleague Kathy Boone would like to welcome you to today's talk, which is a Tale of Two Cities. It's a sort of rewriting of Charles Dickens' novel, Tales of Two Cities, Pro-Democracy Protests, and Beijing's Lengthening Shadow in Bangkok and Hong Kong 2015 to 2025 with Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom and with Wichuta Teeratanabodee. So let me say a few words in terms of some housekeeping and then introduce our speakers properly and then leave you in their capable hands. So first of all, today's talk includes some online participants who are welcome to join us with some questions. If they post them in the chat, we can try and include them in the Q&A section of today's proceedings. Today's talk is also being recorded, so behave yourselves. Watch, mind your manners, mind your P's and Q's. And also, just in terms of social media, if you want to post about this event, please be sure to tag us, SEAC. In particular, from the center's perspective, I don't know if we have a comparative politics CPE social media thing going. I doubt it. And the Southeast Asia Center is on LinkedIn and Instagram and also on YouTube, where you'll be able to find a video of this event and our past and future events as well. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers who are wonderfully different in terms of their generational profiles as well as their research focus. We have Jeffrey Wasserstrom, a very 20th century character joining me from the 20th century, visiting the 21st. Distinguished professor of history at the University of California at Irvine, where he also holds courtesy appointments in law and literary journalism, and writes for a wide range of periodicals and has published a long list of books covering the full breadth of more than 100 years by now of protest in China, in particular, Shanghai in particular. So has a long history of studying protest movements. His most recent book is The Milk Tea Alliance, published earlier this year by Columbia Global Reports. And his next book is Everything You Wanted to Know About China But Were Afraid to Ask. And that will be published early next year by Brixton Inc. And then joining us from the 21st century is Wichuta Teeratanabodee, who's a PhD candidate in politics and international studies at Cambridge. And she, in her research, focuses on social movements in East and Southeast Asia, and in particular, their transnational linkages. And she's already been published widely in the Journal of Contemporary Asia, the Journal of Democracy, New Mandala, and elsewhere. So they're joining together in this project, spanning different country expertise and generational perspectives. So please join me and welcome them today.
Thanks so much. That was really an engaging introduction. The only thing I want to make sure people realize is I've been writing about protests that happened across a century. I haven't been writing about them for a century. The other thing I want to make clear is that I'm going to talk about younger activists than my colleague will. And finally, that Wichuta and I have written two pieces together. But we didn't meet until Saturday. Until that point, we had done all of our collaboration via Zoom. So at least it was a 21st century kind of collaboration. Whereas the first time I co-wrote something with somebody, we sent faxes back and forth across the ocean to do that. Two more things about the two of us. One is that I believe that co-authorship should always be in alphabetical order for authors, because I believe these are full collaborations, and I almost always have to go last then, and that has continued with a T name. But I usually have the harder name to pronounce when people are introducing me, and in this case, in many settings, I think if we gave a talk in anything other than a Southeast Asian center, the stumbling might be over your name rather than Wasserstrom. Anyway, without further ado, what I wanted to do was very quickly explain why somebody who was trained in Chinese studies and trained as in Asian history, but really what that meant was East Asian history. And very strangely, when I was doing a PhD in Chinese history, studying the student movements, nobody told me, have you read up on Thailand? Have you read up? They had important student movements in recent memory at this point when I was doing it in the 1980s. And even when I was working on Tiananmen in 1989, nobody said you should really read up on Burma because something very parallel happened there in 1988. And it wasn't until I was teaching at Indiana University and somebody came to see me to say that he was a participant in the 1988 Burmese uprising, and he had made it to the West to study, and he wanted to do a senior thesis comparing 1988 in Burma and 1989 in Tiananmen. And his name is Tun Mint. He's gone on to be a significant figure in Southeast Asian studies. At the time, what really struck me, and I bring this into the Milk Tea Alliance thing, because he's a figure I talk about ties between different places before the recent ties between student movements. But what struck me the first time I met him was that he was one of the gentlest souls I had ever met. And by the end of our conversation, he mentioned, I said, what did you do after you were part of the uprising? He said, well, I went into the rainforest and joined a guerrilla guerrilla group. And I thought, my gosh, this is something different is going on here. But I didn't go further into Southeast Asia until the road that led me there, which I'll just explain very briefly, was that I started out working on Chinese student movements, and then the kind that interested me stopped happening there. And so I moved on to other topics. After there stopped being the kind of student-led movements that spread to other social classes that then kept on sustained challenging government. They happened in the 1910s in China, 20s, 30s, 40s. After a break, they happened again in the 1980s. So I went into other topics, but then in the 2010s, things that reminded me of what I'd gone into studying were happening in Hong Kong. So I became fascinated by Hong Kong. By the way, I'd never read a book on Hong Kong in graduate school either. It was seen as not fully part of East, it was in East Asia, but it wasn't really part of Chinese history. So I became fascinated by those. I stayed with those movements. I wrote a kind of some journalism on them, and then Columbia Global Reports, which was doing things in between journalism and academic work. I got the opportunity to write Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink for them. It's been reissued as in the UK as Hong Kong Vigil, the struggle for Hong Kong. Because Hong Kong's past the brink of what the things I was thinking of at that point. And then in the 2020s, early in 2020, I was sort of interested in the influence that the Hong Kong protests, after they were crushed, had in other places, particularly in Thailand. Things were happening. I was seeing things on the television screen that reminded me of things I had seen on the streets of Hong Kong. And I knew that there were some connections between some Thai activists and Hong Kong activists. I began to look more deeply into those. And that was the road to writing the Milk Tea Alliance. People were talking about connections between Hong Kong, Thailand, and Taiwan initially, as they were calling themselves the Milk Tea Alliance, because in those three places, there was always an iconic form of tea drunk with milk. Whereas on the mainland, mainland China, which was seen as a kind of threat to some of these places, the iconic form of tea is drunk without milk. So it was a playful kind of use of pop culture. And in the second part of my part in this presentation, choreographed it, I'll talk a little bit more about pop culture, some of this, what besides milk tea became part of it. But as I was writing the book, I did a deep dive into Thailand. I read things up, and I was delighted by the fact that I worried that there would be people in Thai studies who would guard the border and feel I was a kind of interloper or parachutist, but instead I was really welcomed incredibly. Though not knowing Thai, I found a very bright young Thai collaborator who worked with me on it and gets a with contributions by credit on the book, though under a pseudonym. So if he wants to reveal himself, yeah. But that was somebody who could carry out interviews in Thai that I couldn't do. As I was beginning to work on this Hong Kong to Thailand study, then Burma, the coup came, and there was an uprising there, which initially took a form that was very similar to, again, the things that I said before. So I'll get more into some parallels. There were lots of young faces on the streets in each cases. They were actually an earlier example of Gen Z activism with some millennials involved too, but a lot of Gen Z. We're hearing a lot this year of Gen Z coming to its own in places like Nepal, Morocco, Madagascar, Indonesia. But this isn't the first wave of Gen Z activism, even if we bring in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka before that. There was a 2022, the 2025, or 2024, 2025, or just 20, but actually in 2019, 2020, 21. The third place there was Myanmar, which was, if Thailand was looking to Hong Kong, Myanmar was also looking to Thailand. And I have a show and tell object, which I was given by some Thai activists, which shows a pair of socks that has a Thai, an idea that the Thai junta and the Burmese junta are not so different. And the students who gave it to me, this can be a very depressing kind of thing that you work on movements that crush, but it was really a light moment because they thought this was sort of because they told me about how, every time you walk, you're walking on you're stomping on the authorities. Anyway, so I'll leave it there and hand off to my colleague.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for kicking off the conversation. I'm from Thailand, and I was born and raised there for about 17 years. During that time, I lived through 2 coups. The first one was in 2006, and the second one was in 2014. That was the latest one, and I hope it would be the last one. And but despite all these, I actually grew up not really being interested in Thai politics, especially since university, not being interested in Thai politics as a topic of intellectual pursuit. And I think, for one of the obvious reasons was that when I was growing up, I was always told that politics is for the adults. So for a very long time, I was trying to distance myself. I was trying to be a good student, good kid, right? Distance myself from discussing Thai politics, let's say. And that changed a lot in 2020. So what happened in 2020? It was the year after the 2019 election. That 2019 election was the first election since the 2014 coup. That's the first coup, the latest coup that I mentioned that I lived through. And that coup had installed a military government that ruled Thailand from 2014 to 2019. And that finally in 2019, Thailand had something which was long awaited for, which was an election. Just so that the year later in 2020, then the Constitutional Court would disband a progressive party called the Future Forward Party that gained quite a significant popularity amongst the younger generation. So that was when I think I started to be kind of interested in Thai politics. And it was when I also decided that I wanted to do a PhD. So that was my kind of first interest in Thai politics. And I'll explain in a bit slowly how that sort of grew into expanding into Hong Kong and Taiwan. When the Future Forward Party was dissolved, a lot of discontent was erupted, and university students, who I assume voted for the party, began gathering on campuses. And even though I was abroad at that time, I was living in Sweden, I could really sense the shift of mood and the shift of political discourses simply through social media. And there was a lot of anger and disappointment, but at the same time, I sensed hope, and I also could feel some sort of a sense of urgencies among the netizens that, they needed to do something about this. This is not okay. This is not an okay situation in Thailand. And I even saw a high school friend of mine posting from a protest at her university. And that moment was when I really started taking Thai politics seriously. And as the movement unfolded, then more groups started to join. I saw high school students, middle school students joining the protest, which was something very fascinating. Again, I kept going back to that thing that I was taught that politics is for the adults. and I, saw a lot of kids kind of joining the protests on the streets. And they raised this one issue, which was to go against the authoritarian school rules, the strict requirements on hairstyles, on uniforms. And what struck me was how these young protesters managed to link their everyday encounters and lived experiences to the broader idea of democracy. I thought that was fascinating. And other than that, there were other social groups, they would bring along their political causes like gender equality, legalizing same-sex marriage, back then when Thailand still didn't allow same-sex marriage, as well as dismantling capitalist monopolies and professionalization of sex work, among other things, right? That was going on. And that sort of sparked my first research project about Thai politics, to really look into how different social groups managed to bring along their political causes and kind of tie them together under the idea of democracy. And as part of the project, I conducted interviews with protesters, with activists, and through the interviews and conversations with them, one of the questions that I asked them was, how did you prepare, like before you go into a protest, how did you prepare physically or emotionally or like psychologically? It's sort of, I feel like you need a lot of courage to join these movements, especially with the police guarding around. And one big takeaway of finding for me was that while the movement was triggered by mostly domestic political factors, like especially the dissolution of the party, but also an abduction of a Thai human rights activist who was living in exile in Cambodia at the time, Wanchalom. And there were a lot of transnational elements involved. One thing that was continuously pointed out, which you can see in the first photo, right? The people that I was interviewing was telling me how they were preparing helmets, bottles of water, umbrellas, and a mask. And they also learned some basic hand gesture, like hand signals, just in case that the protests would turn chaotic, then they would be able to communicate with one another. And that was kind of directly learned from Hong Kong in 2019. So I kind of started to sense already that there's something beyond the confine of domestic politics in Thailand that I should be looking at. And just a few months, Jeff mentioned, just a few months before the Thai protests began in early 2020, just after, the Milk Tea Alliance also emerged, right? And we would remember it as me mocking the CCP and that sort of policies. So you can see there was one of the memes calling China West Taiwan. That was that's one of my favorites. And it's, because there have been a lot of dispute on the map as well, with the South China Sea and the 9-dash line. And this is kind of them calling, West Taiwan, there's a new Taipei as well. So that's one thing about the Milk Tea Alliance that I think people tend to remember. But there were also other things beyond the memes and beyond the internet, which was street demonstrations and visible signs of solidarity with Hong Kong activists. So you could see those are stickers. There was the Milk Tea Alliance stickers, and I think it came out after early 2021, which was when Myanmar had a coup. So there was something more kind of concrete, something more material that were part of protest movement in Thailand in 2020. So bringing all these together, I think, like kind of circling back to how you came to Southeast Asia, then this is how I I went forward to East Asia as well, which I kind of realized that protest movements rarely happen in isolation. A lot of time, even with Hong Kong in a reverse direction, right? Their rapporteurs, their protest rapporteurs and tactics sort of inspired other movements, even after the movement in Hong Kong itself stopped. So historians have shown us many times how revolutionaries learned from, or they were inspired by one another, or were connected to one another. And I think looking at contemporary movements from a transnational perspective would really allow us to better understand how young people especially engage in politics today. And this idea sort of formed my PhD dissertation project to look into transnational linkages amongst contemporary democracy movements democracy protesters in Asia, including, I'm looking specifically into Thailand, Myanmar, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. I think I'll give the floor back to you, and I'll just kind of dive into that later on.
Great.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. So one of the things that has been in the news lately a lot has been Gen Z protests in Nepal really brought a lot of attention to it. And then one of the things that has been said is that places, initially there was talk of it as perhaps an Asia Spring, thinking about Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. But then it was also moving toward a global setting. And there were people who looked back to Arab Spring when it was being talked about as Asia Spring. But then there was the discussion of the one piece flag, the flag from a manga that became a live action series, incredibly popular globally. And there started being protests, this pirate flag, a particular kind of Jolly Roger flag, showing up. It was in Indonesia early in the year, then in Nepal. And then after Nepal, it really took off. And in Madagascar, Morocco, Peru, something much beyond Asia. And it was when we were thinking about this and talking about it, and there were a few journalists who asked me to comment on whether there was any kind of parallel to be drawn from the Milk Tea Alliance moment. There were ways that there did seem to be things that could be learned from looking back at the period from 2019 to 2021, which in an Asian studies context will be talked about with the Milk Tea Alliance thing. It's a flow within a region, a geographical places that are in geographical proximity, but not necessarily the region as they're defined in scholarly studies, because this included East Asia and Southeast Asia. And in this period, you have Indonesia and Nepal, which are not thought of as in the same region. And actually, some Nepalis who were interviewed about the protests said they didn't typically think of Bangladesh as a place to look to, but it became interesting to look to, and something about it being nearby added to the sense of it being. And this has been something that happens persistently once you start looking for it. It goes back, and it goes back as when I asked Tun Mint, what was it that really set you on the path to teenagers like you in tea shops in Burma? What were you talking about? He said, we were talking about the Philippines, because there had been people power. And it wasn't the same. And academics also divide up regimes into the type of, even authoritarian, it's the type of ones. The Philippines was an American-backed dictatorship. Burma was not an American-backed military dictatorship. And yet, for people thinking about what kinds of things are frustrating us, there were things that were parallel. What might we be able to do? There were things of thinking. And people actually, revolutionaries and radicals, have been thinking across regions, but also thinking across regions in many different times. Sun Yat-sen was fascinated by an earlier period of the Philippines rising up. So anyway, we'll give you just, was not planned when we originally were thinking of this, because some of this hadn't happened. But the two of us are co-writing a piece right now with an exile and activist from Belarus. In 2019, everything that Wichuta said about Thailand was the lead up pretty much to the protests in Belarus. There had been a military strongman in power. There had been an election in 2019. It had been an election in which there was no opportunity given for the opposition, no matter how popular it became, to take power. And then there were protests there. And then, though this isn't part of the Milk Tea Alliance story, the protesters were looking in part to Hong Kong for things like the be water kind of approach to flexible tactics and a variety of things. In each of these places in 2019 through 2021, there were more women on the streets in visible roles than there often were in earlier times in those settings. This was true of Hong Kong, it was true of Thailand, it was true of Belarus. There were also then, what we're zooming in on is this idea of, first of all, that this was an earlier Gen Z wave of activism. And that from our thinking about this wave, this earlier wave, there are things that we think could be useful to keep your eye on. One is that even when something seems to be happening, a symbol seems to be uniting people across many different parts of the world, if you dig deeper, you'll probably find localized meanings of it. you'll probably also find particularly strong ties regionally, even within a global kind of thing. So you need to think simultaneously to kind of local, transnational, but regional and global. And that's actually not typically how scholars or necessarily journalists do this. The scholarship on social movements often either is about one place or about the global 1960s or the world. That regional perspective, especially if it's regional places nearby, but not necessarily regions as they're constructed, not necessarily tied by language, not necessarily. So look at what's happening nearby places, look at what's happening in the past in one place, and think about it globally. So I'll just give the example of this. One of the really interesting things was for global in 2020 after Hong Kong, the global thing was Be Water, was an idea of a particular Hong Kong style of protest that was picked up. And there were even some people in the Black Lives Matter movement, even though it had its own very much dynamic in the United States, who were thinking there were things to learn from Hong Kong about how to creatively deal with tear gas, with very commonplace things like traffic cones. So there were ways of doing that. Sometimes people are now talking about this, like, yeah, this Gen Z thing with the manga, what's the deal with that, with a pop culture thing being taken onto the streets? Well, we've seen it before. We saw it before, going back before Gen Z, things like the mask from V for Vendetta. I think you can make an argument, you can see some elements from back all the way to the French Revolution. But what you saw in 2019 through 2021 was the Be Water thing was from a Bruce Lee video initially. So it was something that went from popular culture to the streets, and then was already partly global, but went global, even though Bruce Lee had regional things. The thing that has a regional, but not just within a kind of standard region that I'm obsessed with is the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games, if any of you don't know the story of the Hunger Games, close your ears, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert about it, which is that it's young people from different places within a territory who are encouraged to think of themselves as quite separate and compete with each other, but they're all under the thumb of a powerful capital city. And they rise up against the more powerful capital, they form solidarities with each other, and they win. So you can see how this would be a quite compelling thing. The symbol of resistance in it is a three-finger salute. The three-finger salute was used in Thailand by some people in 2014 until the junta realized what it was about and banned it. It was used by some people in Hong Kong as well. Some of the people in Hong Kong and Thailand began paying attention to it. But it really took off. The Hunger Games, the other thing is there's a slogan in it, if we burn, you burn with us. And that really took off in Hong Kong in 2019. And then in 2020, the symbol, the three-finger salute, took off in Thailand, and then took off in Myanmar, across the border, looking at Thailand. So the Hunger Games, the three-finger salute is could be a wonderful global symbol for resistance. It's not, it didn't go beyond the region. And some people say, well, oh, this is looking to Hollywood and American culture again. But it was given there was another thing that was global at that time that came from Hollywood, was the song Do You Hear the People Sing from Les Miserables, was sung around the world, including in Belarus, Thailand, Hong Kong, and Myanmar. But only in Thailand and Myanmar was the Do You Hear the People Sing sung with a three-finger salute. So you can think of this like what happens with foods. There are foods that are distinct from different places, but a fusion version only exists in one place and becomes very much kind of localized there. I'll just give you an example of how localization happens. I've talked about region, talked about global. Local things was the song was sung sometimes in English, but sometimes in a local language. One great thing about songs is you translate them, you have to be fairly free because you have to be able to sing them. In Hong Kong, the Cantonese, a wonderful poet, Tammy Ho, back-translated the song from Cantonese into English, and it becomes Who Has Not Spoken Up Yet. So it becomes actually a different kind of meaning. It's always a song of resistance. Why aren't the people listening to us? In Hong Kong, it became, of course, they're not going to listen to us, but don't you want to be remembered as the kind of person who used whatever space you had at the time? And these are just some images of it. The Thai version of Katniss Everdeen the hero from the Hunger Games who leads the revolt, holding up 3 fingers, but localizing it is a Thai slogan from that meaning, essentially, let it end with this generation. In Hong Kong, the Agnes Chow in a leader in 2014, active in 2019, but in between, she was part of a political party that, like the political parties in Thailand, was banned when it started gaining some popularity. And they ran an ad for her running for office called "This Younger Games." You know about the Hunger Games, were the Younger Games. And there's a fight like a woman. I like to have something in anything I give that is actually first time revealed. It's brand new. That was something I saw in a Chinese diaspora exile bookstore called the Nowhere Bookstore in The Hague, where I gave the talk before this. And that was from Myanmar, Fight Like a Woman, with a 3-finger salute, was there. And it was sent to them from Thailand as a gift because there's a Nowhere bookstore in Thailand. There's something emerging called the Republic of Nowhere. You can be a citizen of the Republic of Nowhere, and you get stamps in your passport whenever you go to a Nowhere bookstore. And there's one in New Zealand that's just opened, and one in Taiwan. So these are examples, but I think wherever you push at it, if you look hard and you know where it's worth looking, is what is distinctively local, what is distinctively regional, or just in one part of the world, or it can maybe regions, places that are nearby, or one type of political system, and what is global. I'll leave it there. Back to you.
Yeah. Okay, good. No, thank you for covering what was happening on the streets and kind of mentioning bookstores, because that's what I'm going to talk about. So a few points before we look into all these photos. I'm interested in the idea that activism and movements do not just take place on the streets. We saw memes as examples of activism-related activities that kind of take place on the internet, on the digital platforms. And I also wanted to look beyond the internet itself and beyond kind of city squares or streets where protesters usually gather. And the second point is that when I'm exploring these kind of cross-border interaction and looking at them, I look at them as material. I try to look at them through the material manifestation of solidarity. A bit of context with some kind of theoretical blend in. When we talk about solidarity, and we hear the word solidarity, transnational solidarity all the time across different protests, it usually represents some sort of emotion, some sort of feeling. And as someone, I'm not very good in political theory, I find it very difficult to grasp what it means. Like, what do people mean when they say they stand in solidarity with someone else? And that kind of led me to try to explore the idea of solidarity through things, through objects, and through sort of more material or concrete forms of transnational solidarity. So these 2 points, beyond the street, beyond the internet, as well as trying to look into transnational solidarity, kind of led me to look into activist spaces that help create and sustain and shape transnational solidarity amongst activists. I drew a lot from the work of historians Tim Harper and Sunil Amrit on the size of Asian interactions. And I learned a lot reading through different examples of how Asians, they're historians, so they work on like historical projects, but in the past, how kind of non-elite Asians interacted and how different size mean to different forms or different kinds of interaction. And today I wanted to talk about pro-democracy publishing houses and bookstores and their bars or cafes as sites of transnational interaction amongst democracy activists in East and Southeast Asia. And I think through like these stories, we'll probably stumble upon some of the symbols that Jeff mentioned, whether it's local, more regional, or more kind of global. A bit of a small note, I use publishing house very loosely here. Some of them don't publish books per se. They work with scenes, or sometimes it's more on online articles. So the first publishing house is from Thailand. It's called Samyang Press. It was founded by a group of Thai activists back in 2017. Those Thai activists were or still are university students from Chulalongkorn University, which is the oldest university in Thailand. And Samyan, their name is the name of the district where the university is located. So in 2017, Thailand was under this military regime, as I mentioned, who staged the 2014 coup. This group of students led by Netivit, whose photo was in the, if you could go back one, sorry, previous slide. So the one wearing like the red shirt. So that's Netivit. And go back to the, yeah, thank you. Yeah, he's been a student activist in Thailand for a very long time. And the idea is that they wanted to be democracy activists through the letters of the alphabet. So they wanted to make a diverse range of political and philosophical texts accessible to Thai readers. And their book catalog consists predominantly of physical prints, notably translated works on philosophy and political theory. It includes things like liberalism, socialism, feminism, and nonviolence resistance. So you see work of authors such as Hannah Arendt or Isaiah Berlin and Judith Butler being translated into Thai by Samyan Press. So that's the first category. The second category was more thematic books, thematic topics focusing on politics, global and local struggles for freedom, and cross-strait relations. So one of Jeff's books, the one on the most right, was translated by Samyan Press. It's Vigil, and I think you have the English copy there as well. Yeah. And the third category of books that I'm working with are original books that are actually written by their contributors, which are mostly undergraduate students, university students. They tend to focus on the theme of social history or community history of their university, Chulalongkorn University. And they like the idea of looking at the university from the ordinary people's perspective rather than elites or rather than famous alumni. And this includes biography of a longtime janitor at the university's Faculty of Political Science. I thought it was such a kind of warm touch to, kind of tributing her and her work throughout like her long career of supporting the faculty, right? And they also had a book about this Chinese shrine near in the Samyan district that faced eviction threats from the university's property management office. And Edward and friends are very fascinated about this particular shrine. It's, it has to do with the whole gentrification, the topic of gentrification within Chulalongkorn University as well. So they made a documentary about it, and the documentary also won the Best Documentary Award in Thailand a couple of years ago. So these are all sort of different topics that they're working with, but essentially they wanted to highlight the theme of the promotion of human rights, democracy, and intellectual foundation for a just society in Thailand and beyond. And during the 2020-2021 protests, they also attended the protests, sometimes as protesters, but sometimes as book sellers. So you see them holding books, trying to sell their books to other protesters. And beyond their publishing and trying to disseminate ideas about democracy through books, they also have a bar. So that's another function, which parallels with another publishing house that I will be talking about in a bit. Their bar is called Prasha Bar, and when you translate it into English, it means the people's bar. Prasha means people in Thai. And it serves sort of as a community space where people can gather. They can hold events that talk about social political causes that they wanted to advocate. They can meet new friends. So I was able to attend one event in 2024 last year. It featured 4 women from the Rohingya Women Collaborative Network, which is a collective of Rohingya women who are trying to advocate about the whole human rights issue around the Rohingya topic. And they show documentaries that they made, and during the screening, they also served Rohingya food, which were cooked by the speakers themselves. So the speakers came all the way to Prashabha, cooked food for the audience, and that was the food. And when you put it with the existing decorations of Samyan Press or Prashabha, I thought it was very, very unique and interesting. You have the portrait of Joshua Wong, which has been there for a very long time. His portrait kind of got moved around the space. So the first time I was there, he wasn't there, right? And then there was a Tibetan flag. Someone from, it's not the first time, but a few people have already told me that this looks like a particular scene. Not to say anything bad about Joshua Wong, of course, but it sort of looked like some sort of a ritual for him, right? So that was, and I think this was one of the clear visual example of what I would think as transnational solidarity. So now, as I mentioned, I also came across another space, another publishing house in Taiwan. It's called New Bloom Magazine, which was founded by a group of activists who were very active during the 2014 Sunflower Movement. It's led by someone named Brian Hill. The New Bloom magazine is quite different from Samyang Press in that they work mostly with online articles. They publish daily, so they act almost like a newspaper outlet. But I think the idea are quite similar in that they wanted to create some sort of intellectual or some sort of space where they can talk about or have a political discussion. And their motto is to foster political and intellectual transnational dialogue of the left and sort of act as an alternative outlet of information and news in Taiwan. And similar to Samyang Press, New Bloom Magazine also has a bar called Daybreak. That's a Daybreak photo, and the third one, which has been used as a gathering place for activists, NGO workers, students, teachers, and me when I was there. And they organized events regularly, and they would sell drinks. There was a cocktail named Revolution of Our Time. I have no idea how that tastes like. I know it's a reference from a protest movement in Hong Kong, right? So you also see the Tibetan flag, which kind of resemble what you would see at Prashaba in Thailand, and a few other flags and political symbols going on. So the Rohingya Women Collaborative Network that went to Prashaba to keep a talk and to have an event also went to Daybreak. And during that event, they kind of put up different photos of Rohingya community around Daybreak. And one of those places was right in front of the Lennon Wall, the mini Lennon Wall, which was supposed to be kind of a reference to the Lennon Wall in 2014 in Hong Kong. So I think this highlights a couple of things. First of all, we can really see the circulation of people through Samyang Press to Prashaba and then Daybreak. And with them, the artifacts, the ideas, that's friendship. And while I'm still working on the idea of transnational solidarity, I think this would be a central part of it, the circulation. And the second point is that the depiction of Rohingya and Hong Kong as kind of sharing struggle for freedom was made possible by sites or spaces like Daybreak and of course Prashaba. And speaking of friendship, earlier this year, Brian Hill launched a book, his first book called Taipei at Daybreak. And one of the people that wrote a blurb for his book was Netiwet. So they're friends. The friendship is such a central part in this. I won't have so much time to dive into the third publishing house, which I found. They came out of Hong Kong, but since the national security law, they moved to Taiwan. But just a little bit of note, it's called 1841, which kind of references the year that Hong Kong was established as a city. Yeah, back to you, Jeff.
Great. I think we want to get to questions very fast.
Yeah.
So we'll do just very, there are things that keep showing up in different things, like it was people from Samyang Press who gave me the socks. I had gone there to speak to Netiwet to interview him, and he becomes a central character in the book, but he wasn't able to be interviewed because he'd become a monk. And then he stopped being a monk because it would protect him from military service, and he wanted to challenge the draft. Also, there was that, so one of the things about giving this talk here that's very special, besides us having our first time to do a public event together, is in the audience there are a lot of people who I won't go one by one, but I've read and learned things from about individual places or about transnational kinds of things. I can see somebody in the audience who I've learned about each of the places and I've talked about all of them together. But the one thing I will mention, Thomas Larson is here, and there's a side thing because the two of us have learned a lot from him in different ways. And he was the one who alerted me to the fact that Netuit, to understand Netuit, I needed to think about his mentor, Sulak, an older Buddhist statesman. And Sulak had a tie to the Dalai Lama and a connection through the Engaged Buddhist Network. And it was actually a way in which, if you look at one way to read also the Joshua Wong and the Tibetan flag, is to think of different generations of transnational Asian connections. Also, if you you may have noticed that people teased Netuit when he got really interested in Joshua Wong and said, yeah, you two should be friends. You both look alike. You're both nerdy guys with thick glasses. And this was one thing that's not what the basis of the relationship was, but it's a story that Netuit likes to tell. They also were both religious, but different religions, but in the spirit of some kinds of like Engaged Buddhism, there was reaching out to people in other religions. In this case, Netuit thought the fact that he saw his faith and his activism connected linked up to Joshua also. We want to end with one slightly more menacing side to transnationalism. And I'll mention, there's a forthcoming book in the Columbia Global Report series by Sonia Falero, The Robe and the Sword, which is about transnational flows within Asia that fuel hate, which is also another side to the side of solidarity. She's talking about things like anti-Muslim hate. But there's another menacing side to the transnational story, which is that the regimes in different places learn from each other while activists are learning from each other. And in Hong Kong and Thailand, there have been certain things that connect them. Thailand, we know, has a lèse-majesté tradition. When there were Hong Kong booksellers who were kidnapped in 2015 and spirited onto the Chinese mainland, it was not because they were publishing Hannah Arendt. It was because they were publishing things about specific Chinese leaders, top leaders, sometimes lightly sourced negative ones. In the arrest, it's not lèse-majesté, but it's a similar kind of trying to make discussion of those figures taboo. Another kind of flow between Hong Kong and Thailand, when Joshua Wong was invited by Netuit to Thailand, he was blocked at the border. This was presumably and held in the airport, presumably by Thai authorities in taking heed from Chinese authorities. But since 2019, there's been a pattern in both Thailand and in Hong Kong. Well, during the protest, there was a pattern of police using violence, but no massacre, large amounts of tear gas, but again, not limiting the kind of massacre imagery that might galvanize more global attention. And since then, there's been a pattern of what I recently learned is called charge stacking, where you arrest people, you sentence them to a couple of years in prison, which isn't enough to make it seem as really horrific. And then while they're in prison, you charge them with something else and you extend them. Anon Nampa in Thailand, the human rights lawyer, is now up to about 20 years on lèse-majesté charges that are then retrospectively based on things that happened before. Joshua Wong was due to be released from prison quite soon, but then they came up with something else to charge him with. So we've been fairly upbeat, both of us, with friendships and solidarity, and popular culture, and those are important things, but there also is this other darker side.
Yeah, and I think apart from like peer learning, kind of seeing what other authoritarian regimes or countries are doing, I think one thing I wanted to point out, which happened recently, was sort of interventions into an art exhibition in Bangkok by a PRC embassy in Bangkok. So earlier this year, a group of artist activists came together from different places like Russia, including Russia, Iran, Syria, Myanmar, and Hong Kong, and they collaborated on a project exactly to point out the collaboration between authoritarian regime, and they call it the constellation of complicity, visualizing the global machinery of authoritarian solidarity. So the exhibition put together different pieces of arts, but this is kind of the one, probably the biggest piece I saw there, and it took place at the Bangkok Art and Culture Center. So in the middle, there's Minong Line from Myanmar, but then there was a handshaking gesture from other leaders from other countries. You see, oh, there was Kim Jong-un got cut, sorry. And then there was Hun Sen, and there was, yeah, you can see up there, right? And that's that one of that interpretation of complicity amongst authoritarian regime. And it was this was made by a Burmese artist. And the exhibition began on 24th of July this year, and within the first few days, it was visited by someone from the Chinese embassy. This is public information, so I just basically synthesizing this from a lot of news outlets. But so later on, the Chinese embassy requested the removal of a Tibetan flag and the censoring of one art video and a removal of one art installation, among other things. So yeah, and in the end, from what I read, the Tibetan references got hit the most. And that was when I visited the exhibition in August, the photo on the right, that was kind of the result of it. So they had to redact some artist names and they had to remove some pieces, although most things stay, as I read. But I thought that was the gimmick initially. I thought that was kind of meant to be from the very beginning. That's how you would expect when, you know, people work on authoritarianism and they wanted to self-censor, that what they would have done. I mean, it's a gimmick in the end, but it wasn't like that at the beginning. And that sort of, yeah, it was kind of right into my face that, you know, the exhibition was happening in Bangkok, and with the request of the Chinese embassy, then that's the result. So I think that would be, I also want to, yeah, leave some time for Q&A as well. Thank you.
So what am I let you guys field your own Q&A, but maybe I'll the door open so it cools out a little bit.
Do we love any? This is
Thanks, Jeff, for just coming to London way more than you'd expect this year as well. But this is a question, I guess, kind of more for Wichuta, who has been, you know, working on this more recently. But I guess for you as well, because you're still in touch with some of the people that, you know, you reached out to during this project. But I guess I was wondering, you know, you basically focus in your book and in your work on like a cast of characters, like, you know, academics, activists, and whatever, and, you know, these spaces like bookstores and tea houses that have basically made activism kind of their industry. They've been, you know, they've benefited from it. They are still deeply involved in it, and they think very, very consciously about this on a daily basis. But I was just wondering, essentially, are there examples of non-activists or people that you meet, you know, in your everyday life, people who might have joined protests in Hong Kong or in Thailand, who have different afterlives, you know, who do think about these connections, and if so, what shape do they take, or do you notice more ordinary examples of this? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I guess there are different kinds of afterlives that you can look into. Some people quit activism entirely, and if you were to follow the book of a Thai scholar, Kanokrat Lachusukun, right? She studied the afterlife. Oh, yeah.
PhD.
Yes, yeah. Johnson. She studied the afterlife of the 1970s activists, student activists and revolutionaries in Thailand, and through decades of, you know, their afterlife, different people went to do different things. So there are those who quit entirely, there are those who join political party of like different strands. And I think it hasn't been so many years after the 2020. So I'm speaking from a Thai protest perspective, but it hasn't been so many years. It's been only 5 years, 4 years. So so far I've seen people who just announced like publicly that they would quit. You'd see Yok, right? I forgot her full name, but yeah, one young activist announced that she would quit on Facebook. And then there are people who've gone into academia to do a PhD. I was never an activist, but yeah, I mean, I'm aware of some people have gone into, or some have gone into NGOs. So that I think really different, and some of course are like still in jail, so you have to account for them as well. Some have been in and out of jail, and some like Anon that you still mentioned, yes, mentioned are still in jail. But I think like transnational here, like just to circle back to the topic of the discussion, I think transnational solidarity is something quite, and has always been quite exclusive in a way. Like you need certain kind of resources and certain kind of time. Like you need a lot of time, some sort of ability to speak in English, for example, if you want to interact with someone abroad. So I think, yeah, it's a bit more kind of limited on that sense. Yeah.
I just give a couple of examples. One from one way to think of it is that as time goes on, some activists are looking to different kinds of transnational connections. In the Hong Kong diaspora, and you can see this in the events in London that take place periodically. I saw one in 2023 when I was here as a visitor. There'll be less discussion of the Milk Tea Alliance per se, and more of connections between Tibet and also the Uyghurs. And there was one very dramatic action in the lead up to the winter the Winter Olympics in Beijing, where a Hong Kong activist and a Tibetan member of the Tibetan diaspora went together to Athens to protest together. The other thing, though, as a historian, to say that the history of Chinese student protests and the history of American student protests and European student protests too show that one generations of activists sometimes end up being the next generation of administrators who are dealing with activism and not always in completely sympathetic ways. And there is a way, or they become officials, or they become that. So there are things in the long run to look for that's another. Though plenty of people who simply stop out, or shift their focus to something new.
Question for Jeff. Just in the topic of iconography, for example, like the Candice Everdeen posture, I guess that came out of like the linguistics of like certain groups of activists. But I wonder how well that kind of iconography translates to maybe other kinds of activists who didn't watch Hunger Games or not even familiar with pop culture. It's like, how do you coordinate like the level of like symbolism where people don't have common like knowledge what the symbols are?
That's great. Actually, that gives me an excuse to tell one story I like to tell, which was about the Myanmar's representative to the UN after the coup said he no longer felt that was a legitimate government to represent, and he announced this to the UN, and he said, "I'm now on the resistance," and he held up his fingers. And his daughter said, "That was really great, Dad, but you held it up wrong." It's like, this was Tim McLaughlin, who did some great writing on both Myanmar and Hong Kong, said that story. So that was one where, but I think like the three-finger salute now has a significance, can be totally detached from the place it began with the Hunger Games. Just like lots of people can talk about Be Water and not think of Bruce Lee. The three-finger salute also gets like localized, so people come up with other stories about it. So one story in Thailand is that it stands for liberty, equality, and fraternity, and it kind of links it back to the French Revolution. So this kind of the symbols, and they can be detached from their origin and they can be localized, and so that would be another thing. I'm glad you mentioned that. That would be another thing to look to for the pirate flag. For some, it's just pirates. It's not actually the manga. And interestingly, the Hunger Game salute is not used. One place it's not used is America. The books began, and one place where the pirate flag hasn't been used is in Japan, where it began. So some of this is about those. But you see this playing the historian again. You see it over and over again. In Tiananmen, one of the big symbols was the goddess of democracy statue, which in some of the lazy reporting was said to be the Statue of Liberty, and to show American influence. But liberty is a different word than democracy in Chinese. It shows the word democracy. the picture, the statue was not an exact copy of the Statue of Liberty. It had Chinese features. Some people thought of it as linking up with the Guanyin statue. And then if you also say if the Statue of Liberty is seen as an American symbol, the Statue of Liberty was given to the United States by France. And the Goddess of Liberty imagery was borrowed in France from the classical world. So you have these sort of cultural transmissions where things take on different meanings as they flow across borders. Thanks for that.
So we've seen how other human rights activists have affected these like culture in Thailand, but how has the Thai military affected culture in Thailand?
You mean in which way? Like, sorry, could you?
Like, as in, would it leave some kind of like habits? What kind of habits would it leave with people?
I'm not really sure if I'm getting this right, but I think one of the things I could raise is that the students who are like high school, middle school students who are protesting, right? And they brought the so-called that I mentioned authoritarian school rules. They argue that it was militaristic. It was meant to be some sort of a kind of training people to be. It was as if they were in a military, that there's so strict rules that they had to obey, and the uniforms as well as the way they interact with teachers, which in one way kind of resembles how younger military or more junior military officers had to interact with more senior military officers. And I think there was that. It's more like I feel like the protesters sort of saw military/authoritarian, which a lot of time are synonymous in Thai society, in their everyday life. So that was more like a kind of trigger, or was the cause for them to protest against the military, who were at the time, who were not at the time, but for a long time was in the parliament, the government in Thailand.
So one thing that happens in social movements, and it's a complicated thing, is sometimes social movements take symbols of authority and play with them and intentionally invert them. For example, in the Chinese past, there's an example of holding mock trials to punish government officials. And sometimes this is done to mock or understand, but sometimes social movements inadvertently replicate some elements of the things they're challenging. So at Tiananmen, the one that there's been the most literature that I know of in an Asian context, there was talk about how on the square, even though there was a discussion of wanting to repudiate the things about the Communist Party, there was a mix of inverting some rituals of the Chinese Communist Party, but also some, maybe this was what you were getting at, sort of coming up with a language of denunciation within the movement that was uncomfortably like some things that had happened in campaigns. I mean, there was the focus on haircuts, and one of the things that also happens is authorities can do something like giving into one of the even when they're suppressing a movement, sometimes they actually are trying to get rid of something that could be a potential future grievance. And now actually the military style haircut has been abandoned, and that was something that Netuit had begun his career as an activist in his teens, arguing against, and he wrote a piece about a bittersweet victory, because yes, you got that, but you didn't get the other things you wanted. After Tiananmen was suppressed in 1989, but some of the things that students who took to the streets wanted was more freedom, personal freedom, more choice, listen to music they liked, wear a hairstyle, and the government let the next generation have more of that, in part to minimize the chances of having to face the same kind of crisis. There was a question over here.
Yeah, I just had a question about, you talked really nicely about sort of transnational solidarity movement. And then Jeff briefly touched on the French Revolution, people drawing inspiration from the French Revolution, and sort of you can see in that period of time with the French revolutions, there being a transnational solidarity movement of, the springtime of Europe, France sneezes and Europe catches a cold. Can you reflect on how the advent of mass communication technologies has sort of really changed, and whether you see it just as sort of making it higher volume, or whether it's really changed the aspect of how transnational solidarity happens?
Yeah, so I'm glad you, I was, the scholar who influenced me probably the most in graduate school was Lynn Hunt, a very wonderful story of the French Revolution and the symbolism of revolutions. And I kept up with the field of French Revolutionary Studies, and the connections to Haiti and has become a major subject there, which is important. So when you go back, you often see the same things happen. And that was done with earlier. There's a book, Micah Ospah. I'm forgetting the name of the book, Friends of Liberty or something like that, which is very good at this thing. He was a PhD at UC Irvine, so I can remember more. But I read it and found it inspiring while I was working on this. But that was with letters, corresponding societies, and so my fundamental idea is that we see more parallel, we see more continuities, except that things can spread farther, faster with new technologies. And this is true when the telegraph comes in, it's true when the when radio comes in, it's true when television comes in, and it's true with, even more so amped up with social media. But social media is so global, and we're talking about digital natives, that then I think it's an interesting puzzle. Why does proximity continue to matter? At this moment when you can draw inspiration from everywhere, and the activists do draw inspiration from all over the place. They at the Samyen, when I was looking at the books collected by Samyen to possibly translate, they were reading, and they've translated Rebecca Solnit. They're looking at all kinds of places. If somebody in Thailand knows about mansplaining, it's probably because of Samyen's best-selling book, which is Men Explain Things to Me by Rebecca Solnit. But they also there was a book, We Are All Greta. I mean, there's some interest in, and I think Samyen has published one thing on the kind of largely European climate extinction, the Fridays for Future group. So, and there is this sense, so it's not just about proximity, but why there should still be this kind of density that people are looking is a conundrum, I think, in a period when we're thinking about social media being particularly global. It doesn't always stay in a region, but it has that kind of tightness to it, or sometimes only specific regions. And sometimes it's because of the issue involved, but sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's because the people actually meeting each other, and that forms a connection.
Okay, I wanted to add something, like just to kind of say on top of it. In a lot of authoritarian contexts, when you can't really talk about issues within your country. So for example, in Thailand, talking about royal family is highly sensitive. It could, get you in trouble with the lèse-majesté law. But what I've seen also that activists from other countries managed to talk about the Thai royal family, while activists in Thailand were talking, for example, about post-national security law, Hong Kong. So there was kind of that sort of exchange as well. They might not know each other personally, but I think it's sort of social media sort of open more space for people to still keep their political causes or political demands continue, even after, more repression or whatever going on at home.
And
yeah, sorry.
And sorry, James Buchanan, who's one of the rare people who actually spent time in Hong Kong and Thailand, an academic, and writing about it, called it protest swapping. I don't know if it's his term or not. And there's a great example of it. Francis, one of the activists in Thailand in 2020, was inspired by Hong Kong, went outside the Chinese embassy in Bangkok on Chinese National Day and sang Glory to Hong Kong, a song that was banned in Hong Kong. And that was exactly like what you were describing.
We have two questions from our online participants. So let me read them to you. One is from Pablo Henri Didou. He's a researcher at the Autonomous National University in Mexico City. And he says he's wondering if protesters around the world are facing harsher oppression by the different governments. As internationally, we see an open shift towards more authoritarianism. And then we have a question from Kwasi G, PhD student from Cambridge. What does Palestine figure in transnational solidarities and social movements that you examine?
So taking the second question first, I mean, it's going to figure differently in different places. But when I went my first trip to Bangkok to meet with people from Samyan, they proudly showed me a solidarity with Ukraine painting, beautiful one that they had done on the Chula campus. The second time I went, when I went to the Delicious Democracy Cafe, which is just below where the Samyan press offices were, there were flyers about solidarity with Palestine event coming up. So for some, it's clearly part of the same thing. It's different in different places. So Taiwan, which is more focused on what Beijing's policy toward things are, there can be a different thing, but for some it's completely, so it varies. That's one of the cases where it varies. And about facing harsher repression, I think there certainly is a shift. One of the things is that aside from what's happening inside countries, while there has always been transnational repression, while there's always been efforts to shape what critics of an authoritarian state are doing outside of the state, that's been ramped up. Journal of Democracy had a very sobering piece about this being the global, the golden age, meant in an ironic sense, for transnational repression. And so this ability, and the Hong Kong authorities issuing bounties for Chinese activists in exile. Obviously the Khashoggi case it's not just an Asian story, and it's of course a broader one. It's always interesting though how tools that you would think only go in one direction can go in another direction. Of course, people that imagined the internet would simply be liberating have, of course, had a wake up to how it can also be about surveillance, targeting, and fueling of hate. But I naively thought that drones would be something that could only serve authoritarian side. And then with Ukraine, there's a question about that. But Mint told me the story about how he actually had been hearing about a use of drones to thwart the junta in certain activities in Burma, because he said when he was a youth, the military would just come to where the protest was taking place and fire into crowds. But the best technical minds, creators of drones, were largely part of the resistance. And they were using drones to surveil to see where the army was amassing, and then you move to another place. So often these things often things have a double edge.
Yeah, I think I'll probably focus more on the Palestine one, because I do have some empirical kind of materials to share for my field work that I just came back from. So I think from what I saw, as Jeff mentioned, it varied from place to place. But in Thailand, during the 6th October, which is an anniversary of the Thammasat massacre that happened in 1976, right? So I went to that event in 2024. Yeah, last year in 2024. And I expected something. It's a very sort of sacred and like kind of ritualistic place, and it was a big tragedy in Thai history, Thai political history, and I sort of kind of expected or imagined that it would be mostly domestic kind of political context, but I did see a big sign for peace for Gaza, for Palestine, and kind of anti-Israel symbolism going on. So that was what happening in Thailand that I could see. That definitely more prominent, especially compared to in Taiwan that I saw earlier this year. So I also went to the Tiananmen Square massacre anniversary on the 4th of June. And it was, I think, apart from like that China, talking about Tibet, Xinjiang, and related sort of broader China related issues, and I didn't really see any of these. We did talk to some people and we did ask about whether Palestine is, a topic here at all, and it's been quite, among some activists I talked to this, it's been quite difficult to persuade the public to be on that side, especially because of the China's foreign policy towards this issue. Yeah.
We have time for, yeah.
So my question is, given that like the rise of like community alliance happened in these countries, to what extent would you say that like this affinity have an impact on the creation of like this transnational solidarity?
Do you want, maybe we should take a couple of questions?
My question was because you mentioned the more material transnational solidarity, is that also manifested in other forms than just like some event chat cafes, but rather like external things like maybe support for like visa applications for people who needed to leave, like bail funds, stuff like that, which is like more concrete organizational structures.
The Military Alliance has largely not been about concrete organizational structures. It's been more about sharing information about, even like events like this can advertise to people who might be paying attention to one thing, but not to another, so people who are not paying attention to Southeast Asian here. There are some pragmatic things, like there was some masks to protect from tear gas that were sent from Hong Kong to Thailand as a kind of gift. Like we're not able to use these anymore, and you can. And then that was one Tiananmen vigil held in Bangkok, was to sort of reciprocate that way. So I think part of the reciprocation can seem very fuzzy, but it also, one thing that I think activists for decades have said that one of the things they worry about is being forgotten. This is a way of reminding people they aren't forgotten. So it used to be that there would be letter campaigns before even, I don't know if it was talked about as but Amnesty International would organize things to have letters about people who were, to show they're not rendered. After the Czechoslovakia, the Charter 77 was repressed, there were a group of Hungarian intellectuals who wrote letters of support. There's things you can find earlier examples of things like this. And in retrospect, people say often that it's important to have a sense that people were still remembering them. The Buddhist side, Hong Kong, there were elements of different religions that came into play, including Christianity. And one of the songs that was sung was Hallelujah, My Lord, which was sung, some people said out of true belief, and some people said were sung because the police wouldn't be as quick to interfere with a protest that had a religious song. In Tiananmen, in a similar way, the Internationale was sung because it was harder to mess with people who were singing one of the sacred songs from his party, but also if you really look at the lyrics to it, it talks about doing away with injustice. So you can think of it as a radical song. But I think religion matters, but religion is yet another thing, including Buddhism, that can be something that can go in very different directions, which is why I mentioned the Robe and the Sword book. So I don't think if you were, again, there are different issues in different places.
Yeah, on the material things, I think there are other examples. So when the coup happened in Myanmar in early 2021, then when people started going onto the street and started fighting with the military, activists in Hong Kong wrote this huge manual called HK19 manual, and they posted it on Google Drive or Google Doc, one of them, and they had another Burmese activist to translate that into Burmese. So it was written original in English and then got translated into Burmese, and it was meant to be kind of a guide to how to deal with the authorities, how to fight, and how to organize amongst themselves and so on. Page long, if I'm not wrong. So that was quite meticulous in the details. Other examples I could think of is that, but I think this was very rare, and I don't think it happens a lot, is that I talked to a Burmese activist who fled to Thailand, and he said as he got to Thailand, the Milk Tea Alliance related or associated group gave him settling in allowance. So there was some sort of funding to support his settling into Thailand. But I think that was really rare, the only instance I heard. And other than that, I've come across arts exhibitions. So this is probably one of them, but there are others that are smaller in scale and not necessarily linked to any kind of, Bangkok-based art galleries that I found one or two in Chiang Mai that they hosted a lot of art pieces from Burmese artists. And it was talking about the kind of, the neighbor, Thailand and Myanmar being neighboring countries, and that shared, but not exactly shared political experiences. And through that, it's not just the art exhibition itself or the experiences of the artists, but also how the audience or participants came to interact and sort of learn more about the issues, I think was quite valuable. But also, it was at a time that Myanmar was experiencing a big flood. So there was a big donation going on as well as a result of the art exhibition to sort of send money back to Myanmar. So I think those are some other material kind of, manifestations of what I would see as transnational solidarity.
One other manifestation, because I can't resist mentioning it, is there was the Rap Against Dictatorship was an important band in the Thai protest of 2020, and before that, it was in Netbit with his friends from there. Even though his favorite music is a bit different, American folk songs, and songs from the Thai past, including by one very active revolutionary songwriter, but inspired in part by Rap Against Dictatorship, which is inspired part by Western rap. There was a band formed in Myanmar called Rap Against Hutta, and they organized dating myself, they organized something like We Are the World, a kind of collective effort to draw attention to something where each groups of rappers from different parts of the region. And this was the milk tea, it was described as a Milk Tea Alliance thing. It was advertised with a 3-finger salute, but it included Indonesia and other places that not in the original Milk Tea Alliance. And it was called Dictators Must Die. And it was, the only line I remember was one of the members of Rap Against Dictatorship said, get away, step down, you old men, it's time for a new gen, which sort of leaned into the generational kind of side to it. But these were different, and that was released as a video, with the idea being something you could watch in these different places and think about the kind of shared grievances you have.
Time for another question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So those movements and maybe symbolism, how they influenced each generation or each class differently. So I'm in Thailand as well, so I can't see how like the older maybe generation thinks or why, or how they got influenced by their kids or something like that. But I can't see how the other country going on. Thank you.
Yeah, I've heard, not all symbols carry over as well, and there's sometimes where an older generation wonders about this use of really youth culture symbolism, or wonders about the playfulness and things, like is a little mystified by it, or maybe it doesn't resonate. It isn't a completely youth phenomenon, though, this borrowing from popular culture. I think you can look back in time and see elements of popular culture that previous generations used, or that span generations, including songs like We Shall Overcome, that earlier time, spread across borders and connected across generations. But even this idea of like taking works of fiction and film and acting them out on the streets, which sometimes is said like, as a Gen Z kind of thing. in the United States and in, I think in Latin America and in Europe, there have been some cases of handmaids protests where women concerned about limitations on abortion rights dress up as the handmaids from The Handmaid's Tale, which was a novel that became a television series. And those are not Gen Z, they're not only Gen Z women, there's millennials or older. So there are ways that this can happen, and I think if you really press at it, you can see, again, sort of parallel things that can happen in other times. But it is true that not all symbols play as well in different settings, and not all connect as much with different classes and different generations. And when social movements get to be really big, they tend to have things that are specific to generations and then also cross over with slogans or that some of this is youth oriented, like let it end with this generation. And it's sort of saying we're tired of what's been happening before, but there are ways that things can happen across generations. In Hong Kong, once the police used a lot of tear gas, there were some, and once the chief executive said, likened the protesters to children, her own children, and she said, as a mother, I know sometimes you have to be strict with your spoiled children. That then there was a protest by Hong Kong mothers saying, we're going to show you a real mother when a good mother, when their children are right, support them. So you can have these kinds of things and there were brigades of mothers. Yeah, anyway, there are times when it could hit, but that's not to say that there aren't times also when some of the symbolism loses a group because it's too specific.
Yeah, just to add on a little bit, but not, I don't think, I guess not really on the symbolism side, but more, I always think that protest movement builds on movements in the past. So back to Thailand again, we still see, or I still see discussions or conversations among the 2020 protesters saying that, they're kind of carrying out the unfinished business from the 1970s, right? And you could also go back all the way to like 1932 when Thailand was transformed from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, but it was, for a lot of people, it wasn't considered like a successful democratization. So you could see protest movement in the 70s, also 1990s, and now 2020, that they're sort of trying to finish the unfinished businesses of democratization. So in a way, it's kind of building up on the past. Yeah, and probably would pass on to the next generation.
That's a great way of just listening to you, which is what's so wonderful about collaboration, that I use the idea as the image of fusion or hybrid creations of things from different places, but sometimes you have it from different temporalities or different generations. So there were umbrellas used in Thailand after umbrellas had been a symbol in Hong Kong and was partly the black pepper spray or tear gas. But at the Institute for Social History archive that I learned about from you, as a wonderful collection of materials from 2019 Hong Kong, 2020 Thailand, I found an object there that I did something you're never supposed to do, which was, it was an umbrella, and I opened it up inside, which is superstitious. But anyway, and on the umbrella, which if I hadn't opened it up, maybe I wouldn't have noticed, there was a black umbrella rather than a yellow one, which was the Hong Kong style. But anyway, there was an insignia on it that was a reference to the 1930s veiled. So it was totally Thai and totally connecting the 21st century with the 20th century. And I am a 20th century kind of.
Many thanks to our two speakers for a really productive talk, and for their collaborative effort more generally, and for answering today's questions in such an engaging, extended fashion. Before thanking them, let me just mention that we have some upcoming events in both the Southeast Asia Center and the Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Economy seminar series. On Wednesday, the Southeast Asia Center is hosting Dr. Paul Chambers talking about military politics in Thailand in 2025, including his own experience of incarceration. and then forced to expose them from the country. And then we have more events after the reading week, just as in the comparative politics and comparative political economy seminar series we'll have on Thursday, November 13th. Our colleague David Woodruff speaking about collateral damage lessons on central banking and democracy from the short-lived premiership of Liz Truss. So many interesting talks. Look forward to check out our websites, both Southeast Asia Center and the Comparative Politics, Comparative Political Economy Seminar Series. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking our two speakers.